Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I bring you 8 of the most disturbing true crime stories ever to emerge from the dark woods of the Cascade mountain range. These are not tales spun from imagination or internet folklore, but verified accounts drawn from police reports, witness testimonies, and the harrowing recollections of those who survived encounters that defy rational explanation. What you are about to hear represents some of the most unsettling disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and criminal acts ever documented in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. We will journey through stories of hikers who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only inexplicable clues that baffle investigators to this day. You will hear first-hand accounts of those who stumbled upon evidence of ritualistic gatherings hidden deep in the forest, confronted individuals whose intentions were far more sinister than any wild animal, and experienced events that blur the line between the criminal and the supernatural. Every detail you hear tonight has been carefully verified against available records and eyewitness statements, with only names and certain identifying details altered to protect the privacy and safety of those involved. These stories are as authentic as they are terrifying, and they serve as a stark reminder that the deepest horrors are not found in fiction, but in the real experiences of ordinary people who ventured into the wilderness and encountered something they can never forget. If you have not yet subscribed to Paranoia Files, do so now and activate the notification bell so you never miss an upload when we explore the darkest corners of true crime and the unexplained. Leave a comment below sharing your own experiences in remote locations, or tell me which of tonight's stories disturbed you the most, and I will see you in the shadows. There is a particular scent that haunts me still, even now, years after the events I am about to describe. It is the smell of pine needles warming under the late afternoon sun, mixed with the faint mineral tang of mountain air at high elevation. That combination brings me back instantly to that September day in 2019, to the exact moment when I realized something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. I was 29 years old at the time, working as a marketing consultant in Seattle, and hiking had become my escape from the relentless pressure of deadlines and client demands. Every autumn, without fail, my group of 6 friends would take a weekend trip into the Cascades, and that year we had chosen the Cascade Pass Trail, a route we had hiked together at least a dozen times before. The trail was familiar to all of us, well marked and maintained, with stunning views of glaciated peaks and alpine meadows that seemed to glow gold in the slanting light. We knew every switchback, every creek crossing, every place where the trail narrowed to pass between ancient Douglas firs. I felt safe there, in the way you feel safe in your childhood bedroom or your favorite coffee shop. That sense of security, I have learned, can make you dangerously complacent. Our group that weekend consisted of myself, my college roommate Amanda Davis, 2 brothers named Kyle and Eric Hartman, and a couple, Tom and Simone Rodriguez, who had been married for 3 years. We had all known each other since our early 20s, and the rhythm of our hiking trips had become almost ritualistic. We would meet at the trailhead at dawn, hike for 4 hours to reach the pass, eat lunch at the summit while taking photographs of the peaks, and then descend in the late afternoon, stopping at a brewery in the nearby town before driving back to the city. Amanda had been struggling that summer with a painful divorce and the loss of her job at a tech startup that had folded unexpectedly. She had been withdrawn for months, canceling plans and avoiding phone calls, but when I invited her on this trip, she accepted immediately. And I remember feeling relieved that she seemed genuinely excited. The morning we set out, she was more animated than I had seen her in over a year, laughing at Kyle's terrible jokes and stopping frequently to photograph wildflowers along the trail. She wore her usual hiking outfit, a faded blue fleece jacket, black leggings, sturdy boots with bright red laces, and a well-worn backpack covered in patches from national parks she had visited. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she kept adjusting her sunglasses as we climbed higher and the light grew more intense. The ascent was uneventful, as it always was. We moved at a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water or redistribute weight in our packs. Eric, who fancied himself an amateur naturalist, pointed out various bird species and identified mushrooms growing on fallen logs. Simone complained, good-naturedly, about the steepness of the final mile, and Tom teased her by pretending to sprint ahead. Amanda hiked mostly in silence, but she smiled when spoken to and seemed content to be surrounded by friends and mountains. We reached the pass just before noon, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the low 60s, a light breeze that kept the mosquitoes at bay. We spread out across a rocky outcropping that offered panoramic views in all directions, unpacked our lunches, and settled in for what we assumed would be an hour or so of rest before beginning the descent. I ate a turkey sandwich and an apple while listening to Kyle and Eric argue about the best route for a future backpacking trip. Tom and Simone sat slightly apart from the group, leaning against each other and sharing a bag of trail mix. Amanda sat on a flat boulder about 20 feet from the rest of us, gazing out toward the jagged peaks of the North Cascades. She seemed peaceful, and I remember feeling grateful that she had come, that she was beginning to find her way back to herself. After about 45 minutes, Amanda stood up, stretched, and announced that she needed to use the restroom. There were no facilities at the pass, of course, so this meant finding a discreet spot behind some trees or large rocks, as all of us had done countless times on previous hikes. She picked up her backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and walked toward a cluster of subalpine firs about 50 yards from where we were sitting. None of us thought anything of it. We continued eating and talking, and I honestly cannot say how much time passed before I realized she had not returned. It might have been 10 minutes, or it might have been 20. Time has a strange quality at high elevation, where the light is so bright and the air so thin that minutes can stretch or compress without your noticing. It was Eric who first said something, asking casually if anyone had seen Amanda come back. We all looked around, expecting to see her walking toward us or sitting somewhere nearby, but she was not there. I called her name, and my voice sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness. There was no answer. We were not immediately alarmed. It seemed entirely possible that Amanda had wandered farther than intended, perhaps to find more privacy or to take photographs. Kyle suggested that she might have gone to explore a nearby ridge that offered a different view of the valley below. We all stood up and began calling her name, our voices echoing off the surrounding cliffs. Still no response. Tom walked over to the cluster of trees where Amanda had gone, and the rest of us followed. We found her backpack almost immediately. It was sitting upright against the base of a large fir tree, positioned carefully as if someone had placed it there with deliberation. The zippers were all closed, and when I opened the main compartment, I found everything she had brought: her wallet, her phone, her car keys, a half-eaten granola bar, a water bottle, a fleece hat, and a small first aid kit. Her phone was fully charged, but when I tried to call her own number, it went straight to voicemail. There was no sign of Amanda herself. No footprints in the soft dirt, no broken branches, no indication of which direction she might have gone. It was as if she had simply evaporated. We spent the next 20 minutes searching the immediate area, calling her name and looking behind every tree and boulder. The sense of unease that had been quietly building in my chest began to solidify into something sharper and colder. This was not like Amanda. She was an experienced hiker, cautious and responsible, not the type to wander off without telling anyone or to leave her belongings behind. Simone suggested that Amanda might have slipped and fallen, possibly injuring herself and becoming disoriented, so we expanded our search to include the slopes below the pass. We moved carefully, scanning the ground for any sign of her. A scrap of clothing, a dropped item, tracks in the dirt. We found nothing. By this point, we had been searching for nearly half an hour, and the initial confusion had given way to genuine fear. Kyle called 911 on his satellite phone, and within minutes we were connected to the local sheriff's office. The dispatcher asked for our exact location, a description of Amanda, and details about when we had last seen her. She told us to stay where we were and that a search and rescue team would be dispatched immediately. The wait for their arrival felt interminable. We sat in a tight cluster near Amanda's abandoned backpack, scanning the landscape in every direction, hoping desperately to see her walking toward us. The search and rescue team arrived approximately 90 minutes later, brought in by helicopter due to the remoteness of the location. There were 6 of them, 4 men and 2 women, all dressed in bright orange jackets and carrying heavy packs filled with equipment. They were professional and efficient, asking us detailed questions about Amanda's physical condition, her mental state, her level of hiking experience, and the exact sequence of events leading up to her disappearance. They seemed particularly interested in whether Amanda had exhibited any unusual behavior that day, whether she had mentioned feeling unwell or disoriented, and whether there had been any conflicts or tensions within the group. We answered as thoroughly as we could, but the truth was that there was nothing unusual to report. Amanda had seemed fine, perhaps even better than fine. The team leader, a weathered man in his 50s named Frank, explained that they would begin a systematic search of the area, starting with a radius of 1 mile from the point where Amanda was last seen. He asked us to remain at the pass and to avoid disturbing the ground any further, as they would be looking for tracks and other physical evidence. We were told that a second team would arrive within the hour to relieve us and escort us back down the mountain, as we could not be allowed to remain at the scene once darkness fell. We watched as the search and rescue team fanned out across the pass, moving in coordinated lines and calling Amanda's name in unison. They had tracking dogs with them, German shepherds trained to follow human scent, and the dogs were given items from Amanda's backpack to smell before being released to search. I remember the sound of their barking echoing off the cliffs, sharp and insistent, and the way the handlers moved behind them with focused intensity. Hours passed. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocks and turning the snow on distant peaks a deep orange. The second team arrived as promised and escorted us back down the trail, but we moved slowly, stopping every few minutes to look back up the mountain, as if Amanda might suddenly appear at the tree line. By the time we reached the parking lot, it was nearly dark and there were multiple emergency vehicles waiting. Sheriff's cars, an ambulance, a mobile command unit. We were separated and interviewed individually by deputies, asked to recount everything we had seen and heard. I told my story 3 times, and each time I hoped that someone would find an inconsistency or a clue that would explain what had happened. But there was nothing. Amanda had simply vanished. The search continued for 3 days. Additional teams were brought in, including volunteers from local hiking clubs and a specialized unit with thermal imaging equipment. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the terrain from above. The area within a 5-mile radius of the pass was combed methodically, every trail and off-trail route explored, every crevasse and cave examined. I returned to the mountain each day, unable to stay away, standing at the trailhead and watching the search teams come and go. On the second day, a ranger approached me with news that made my blood run cold. They had found Amanda's boots. They were located approximately 2 miles from the pass, placed side by side on a flat rock ledge that overlooked a steep drop into a forested valley. The boots were still laced, tied in double knots exactly as Amanda always tied them. It was as if she had stepped out of them deliberately and walked away barefoot. The discovery made no sense. The ground in that area was covered in sharp rocks and dense underbrush, terrain that would be nearly impossible to navigate without footwear. There were no tracks leading to or from the ledge, no sign of how Amanda had reached that spot or where she had gone afterward. The search teams intensified their efforts, focusing on the valley below the ledge, but they found nothing. On the third day, the search took an even stranger turn. A hiker on a trail nearly 8 miles from the pass in the opposite direction from where the boots had been found, discovered Amanda's fleece jacket. It was folded neatly and placed on top of a wooden trail marker, as if someone had left it there intentionally for others to find. The jacket was dry and undamaged, showing no signs of having been worn through rough terrain or exposed to the elements. Inside the pocket was a small notebook that Amanda always carried, filled with her handwriting. Sketches of plants, notes about trail conditions, random thoughts and observations. The final entry, dated the morning of our hike, read simply, "Feeling hopeful today. The mountains always know how to heal." There was nothing after that, no explanation, no clue. The search teams expanded their efforts to cover the area where the jacket was found, but once again they came up empty. It was as if Amanda was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that led nowhere, items carefully placed in locations that defied any logical pattern of movement. After a week, the official search was scaled back. The authorities explained that they had exhausted all immediate leads and that the case would remain open, but that the intensive ground search could not continue indefinitely. They assured us that they would follow up on any new information and that the investigation was far from over. But I could see in their eyes that they had no real hope of finding Amanda alive. I returned to Seattle, but I could not return to my normal life. I took a leave of absence from work and spent my days researching missing person cases in the Cascades, looking for patterns or similarities that might offer some explanation. I learned that Amanda was not the first person to disappear in that area under strange circumstances, and that the mountains hold more unsolved mysteries than most people realize. But none of the other cases matched the specific details of Amanda's disappearance. The abandoned belongings, the boots placed with eerie precision, the jacket found miles away in the wrong direction. In the months that followed, I received occasional updates from the sheriff's office, but there was never any real progress. Then about 6 months after Amanda disappeared, I got a phone call from a ranger I had spoken with during the search. He told me, his voice uncertain and hesitant, that there had been multiple reports from hikers in the area of the pass. They claimed to have seen a woman matching Amanda's description walking alone at night, barefoot and wearing only a light shirt and pants, moving deeper into the wilderness at a pace that seemed impossible for someone without proper gear or footwear. The sightings were always at dusk or after dark, and always in remote areas far from established trails. Search teams had been dispatched each time, but they never found any trace of the woman, no footprints or other evidence that anyone had been there. The ranger admitted that he did not know what to make of the reports, and that some of his colleagues believed the hikers were simply seeing shadows or wildlife and projecting their fears onto the landscape. But he wanted me to know, in our case, it offered some small measure of hope or closure. I do not know what happened to Amanda Davis. The case remains open, and I still receive occasional calls from investigators asking if I have remembered any new details or if Amanda has attempted to contact me. She has not. Her family held a memorial service a year after her disappearance, and I attended, standing in the back of the room and listening to people share stories about her kindness and her love of the outdoors. I did not speak because I did not know what to say. How do you memorialize someone who is neither confirmed dead nor truly missing, who exists in a terrible liminal space between presence and absence? I still hike in the Cascades, though I avoid the Cascade Pass trail. I tell myself that I continue hiking because I refuse to let fear dictate my life, but the truth is that I am looking for her. Every time I see a woman with dark hair on a distant ridge, every time I hear footsteps on the trail behind me, I turn around hoping it will be Amanda. It never is. And yet I cannot shake the feeling that she is still out there somewhere, walking barefoot through the mountains, leaving her belongings behind like monuments to a life she has left behind. I do not know if she is lost, or if she chose to disappear, or if something far stranger has claimed her. All I know is that the mountains took my friend, and they have not given her back. I do not believe in evil as a concept. I did not believe in it at least until the summer of 2018 when I met a man who called himself Ray. Before that encounter, I considered evil to be a convenient label that people applied to acts they could not understand, or behaviors that fell too far outside the boundaries of acceptable human conduct. I believed that every terrible action had an explanation rooted in psychology, trauma, or circumstance. I believed that monsters were made, not born, and that with enough understanding and intervention, even the darkest impulses could be redirected or contained. That belief system, carefully constructed over 4 decades of life, collapsed completely during 3 days in August when I worked as a campground ranger at a remote site in the Cascade Range. What I witnessed there taught me that some people are not broken or damaged or misguided. Some people are simply wrong in a fundamental way, as if something essential to human consciousness has been replaced by something else entirely, something that wears humanity like an ill-fitting costume. I was 42 years old at the time, recently divorced, and I had taken the ranger position as a way to escape the suffocating atmosphere of my previous life in Portland. I had worked for 15 years as an accountant at a mid-sized firm, spending my days in a gray cubicle reviewing spreadsheets and attending meetings that could have been emails. The divorce had been amicable but devastating, the kind of slow dissolution that happens when 2 people realize they have become strangers living in the same house. My ex-wife kept the house and most of our possessions, and I moved into a small apartment downtown, but the walls felt too close and the noise of the city too constant. When I saw the posting for a seasonal ranger position at Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, I applied immediately, driven by a half-formed fantasy of solitude and simplicity. I imagined quiet days spent maintaining trails and peaceful evenings reading by lantern light in a rustic cabin. The reality, I would learn, was considerably different. The campground where I was stationed was called Silverbrook, a name that suggested charm and tranquility but which failed to capture the profound isolation of the location. It was situated at the end of a 12-mile dirt road that wound through dense old-growth forest, far from any towns or other facilities. The site consisted of 18 primitive campsites arranged in a rough loop, each with a fire ring and a picnic table, along with 2 vault toilets and a hand pump well for water. There was no electricity, no cell phone service, and no radio communication except for an emergency beacon that would summon a helicopter if activated. My duties were straightforward: collect camping fees, maintain the facilities, patrol the grounds twice daily, and ensure that visitors followed park regulations. Most days were indeed quiet. The campground attracted a steady but modest stream of visitors. Families with young children, elderly couples in RVs, groups of college-aged backpackers using the site as a staging area for longer treks into the wilderness. They would arrive, set up their tents or campers, spend a night or 2 enjoying the forest, and then depart, leaving little trace of their presence. I spent my evenings in the ranger cabin reading paperback novels and listening to the owls call to each other across the darkness. For the first 6 weeks of the season, I felt something close to contentment, a sense that I had made the right decision in leaving my old life behind. Ray arrived on a Thursday afternoon in mid-August, driving a white conversion van with Oregon plates and a bumper covered in stickers from various state and national parks. I was at the entrance station when he pulled up, and my first impression was of ordinariness. He appeared to be in his mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail, a weathered face that suggested he spent significant time outdoors, and clothes that looked like they had been purchased at a thrift store. Faded jeans, a flannel shirt with frayed cuffs, hiking boots that had seen better days. He paid for 3 nights in cash, crumpled 20s that he pulled from a front pocket, and told me that he was traveling through the region and wanted some time alone in nature. His voice was soft and oddly formal, as if he were reciting lines he had memorized. When I handed him his receipt and a map of the campground, he looked directly at me for the first time, and I felt an immediate and visceral discomfort that I could not explain. His eyes were pale blue, so pale they were almost colorless, and they did not blink as often as eyes should. He held my gaze for several seconds longer than social convention dictated, and when he finally looked away and drove toward the campsites, I realized my hands were trembling slightly. I told myself I was being irrational, that there was nothing objectively threatening about the man, but the unease lingered like a bad taste. Ray set up camp at Site 14, one of the most remote spots in the loop, backed up against a steep hillside covered in Douglas firs. I completed my evening patrol at dusk and saw that he had erected a large canvas tent and built a fire in the ring, but he was not visible. His van was parked next to the tent, windows covered with reflective sunshades, and I could hear no sounds from within. I noted his presence in my logbook and returned to the cabin, where I ate a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers before settling in with a novel. I slept poorly that night, troubled by dreams I could not remember upon waking, and when I began my morning patrol, I found myself approaching Site 14 with a caution that felt both necessary and absurd. Ray was sitting at the picnic table eating what appeared to be cold cereal from a plastic bowl. He waved when he saw me, a slow gesture that seemed somehow mocking, and called out a greeting. I stopped to ask if he needed anything or had any questions about the area. He smiled, showing teeth that were surprisingly white and even, and said that everything was perfect, that he had found exactly what he was looking for. The phrasing struck me as odd, but I nodded and continued my patrol. Over the next 2 days, I saw Ray intermittently. He seemed to spend most of his time in or near his van, emerging occasionally to walk the perimeter of his campsite or to sit by his fire and stare into the flames. He spoke to none of the other campers, and they seemed to give him a wide berth, as if they too sensed something off about him. On Saturday morning, I noticed something that sent a cold spike of alarm through my chest. Ray's van had a different license plate than it had when he arrived. I was certain of this because I made a habit of noting license plate numbers in my log, a practice left over from my years in the corporate world where attention to detail was valued. The original plate had been from Oregon, but the plate now affixed to the rear of the van was from California. I stood at a distance, partially concealed behind a tree, and watched as Ray emerged from his tent carrying a toolbox. He walked to the van, opened the rear doors, and spent several minutes doing something inside that I could not see. When he closed the doors and returned to his tent, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I walked back to the ranger cabin, retrieved my binoculars, and from a concealed vantage point, I observed Ray's campsite for the next 3 hours. During that time, a third vehicle appeared in his campsite, a red sedan with Washington plates that had definitely not been there before. Ray was collecting vehicles, changing plates, moving cars around like pieces on a chessboard. I felt sick to my stomach as the implications crystallized in my mind. This was not the behavior of an ordinary camper. This was the behavior of someone who did not want to be tracked, someone who had reasons to obscure his movements and his identity. That evening, during what should have been my routine patrol, I made a choice that violated every protocol I had been taught but which felt absolutely necessary. I waited until well after dark, until the campground was silent and most visitors had retired to their tents or RVs, and then I approached Site 14 with my flashlight turned off, moving as quietly as I could through the underbrush that bordered the campsites. Ray's fire had burned down to embers and I could see no light inside his tent. The van was parked as before, rear doors closed, windows obscured. I crept closer, heart hammering against my ribs, and circled around to get a view through the windshield. What I saw in the beam of my flashlight, which I flicked on for just a second before killing it again, has haunted every hour of sleep I have attempted since that night. The interior walls of the van were covered, every available inch of surface, with photographs. They were Polaroids, the old-fashioned kind with the white borders, and they were pinned up in overlapping layers like scales on a fish. I could not see all of them clearly in that brief glimpse, but I saw enough. They were photographs of faces, human faces, and every single person in those photographs looked terrified. Eyes wide, mouths open in screams or pleas, expressions of pure animal fear. Some of the faces were streaked with tears or blood. Some were so contorted with terror that they barely looked human. And in the corner of the van, pinned prominently as if it were a trophy or a favorite, I saw two photographs that made my blood turn to ice. I recognized the faces. They were from missing person posters that had been tacked to the bulletin board in the ranger station for the past 6 months. A young woman named Jennifer Hollis who had disappeared while hiking near Mount Rainier in February. A man named David Kim who had vanished from a trailhead parking lot in April. Their faces stared out from those Polaroids with expressions of unspeakable horror, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at the final moments of their lives. I backed away from the van slowly, forcing myself to move with control even though every instinct screamed at me to run. I made it back to the ranger cabin and immediately activated the emergency beacon, then locked the door and pulled the heavy wooden shutters closed over the windows. The beacon would summon help, but help was at least 2 hours away, perhaps longer depending on weather conditions and helicopter availability. I sat in the darkness with my back against the door, clutching a hunting knife that I kept in a drawer, and I waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. I heard nothing from outside, no footsteps, no sounds of movement. But I was convinced that Ray knew I had been at his campsite, that he was out there in the darkness deciding what to do about me. I thought about the photographs, about the terror in those faces, and I understood that I had seen evidence of a predator, someone who hunted human beings for reasons I could not begin to comprehend. I thought about his soft voice and his two pale eyes and the way he had told me he had found exactly what he was looking for. And I realized he had been talking about the campground itself, about the isolation and the vulnerability of the people who came here to enjoy nature. The helicopter arrived at dawn, carrying 3 park police officers and 2 county sheriff's deputies. I met them outside the cabin, exhausted and shaking, and told them everything I had seen. They approached Site 14 with weapons drawn, moving in a tactical formation that would have looked absurd in any other context, but which I found deeply reassuring. Ray's tent was there, his fire ring was there, but Ray himself was gone. The van was gone. The sedan was gone. The campsite looked as if it had been methodically cleaned, every trace of occupation removed. The officers searched the surrounding forest for hours, looking for tire tracks or other evidence, but the ground was too hard and too covered with pine needles to retain clear impressions. They found nothing. When they asked me to describe exactly what I had seen through the van window, I did my best, but I knew how insane it sounded. Photographs pinned to walls, faces frozen in terror. Missing persons I recognized from posters. The officers were professional and took my statement seriously, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the unspoken question of whether I had imagined or exaggerated what I had seen in the dark. The investigation that followed was extensive and deeply troubling. The photographs I had described were never found, and without physical evidence, the case could not move forward in any meaningful way. However, the license plate numbers I had recorded proved invaluable. The Oregon plate traced back to a vehicle reported stolen from a rest stop 3 weeks earlier. The California plate belonged to a car whose owner had been missing since June, last seen leaving a campground in Northern California. The Washington plate was from a vehicle that had been abandoned near Seattle in July, its owner never located. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Ray, whoever he really was, had been moving through the Pacific Northwest for months, possibly years, stealing vehicles and changing identities as he went. The FBI became involved, and I spent hours being interviewed by agents who asked the same questions over and over, trying to extract every possible detail from my memory. They showed me photographs of known offenders, pages and pages of faces, but none of them matched the man I had met. They told me in carefully chosen words that were meant to be reassuring but which had the opposite effect, that I was very lucky to be alive. They told me that based on the pattern of vehicle thefts and the timeline of missing person cases in the region, they believed Ray was responsible for at least 11 disappearances over the past 18 months, possibly more. They told me that he had never been caught, never been identified, and that he had a level of skill and caution that suggested extensive experience. I quit my ranger position the day after I gave my final statement to the FBI. I could not remain in that campground, could not sleep another night in that cabin knowing what had been just a few hundred yards away. I moved back to Portland and found a small apartment in a busy neighborhood where I could hear traffic and voices at all hours, where I was never truly alone. I found work at another accounting firm, returning to the gray cubicle and the spreadsheets that I had once found so stifling but which now felt blessedly mundane and safe. I told almost no one about what had happened because how do you explain to someone that you looked into the mobile archive of a serial killer, that you saw the documented terror of his victims pinned to the walls of his van like butterflies in a collector's case? How do you convey the specific quality of dread that comes from knowing that a predator walked past you, spoke to you, smiled at you, and you felt the wrongness of him but could not articulate why? The case remains open. Every few months I receive a call from an FBI agent asking if I have remembered any new details or if I have seen anyone who resembles the man I knew as Ray. I have not, but I read the news obsessively, scanning articles about missing persons and unsolved disappearances in the western states, and sometimes I see patterns that make my skin crawl. A hiker who vanishes from a trailhead, their car found days later with a different license plate. A camper who checks into a remote site and is never seen again, their belongings gone, the site wiped clean. I do not know if these are connected to Ray or if my traumatized mind is finding patterns where none exist. But I cannot stop looking. I cannot stop wondering how many photographs he has now, how many faces he has added to his collection. And I cannot stop thinking about the fact that he is still out there, moving through the forests and campgrounds of the Pacific Northwest, hunting in the spaces where people go to feel close to nature and far from danger. I have learned that evil is not a concept or a label or a failure of understanding. Evil is a man with pale blue eyes who pays his camping fees in cash and tells you he has found exactly what he was looking for. And sometimes evil drives away in the night and is never caught, leaving behind only questions and nightmares and the certain knowledge that somewhere right now, he is looking for his next victim. The last voicemail my husband Kyle left me was recorded at 6:47 p.m. on November 14th, 2019. I have listened to it thousands of times since then, so many times that I can recite every word, every pause, every background noise. His voice sounds relaxed, almost happy, and there is laughter in the distance from one of his friends. He says, "Hey babe, just checking in. We made it to the campsite and everything looks great. Weather is holding, no rain yet. The guys are setting up the tents. I will call you tomorrow night, same time. Love you." Then there is a brief rustling sound, as if he is putting the satellite phone back into his pack, and the message ends. That was the last time I heard his voice. The next day at 6:47 p.m., my phone did not ring. It has not rung with his number since, though sometimes in the middle of the night I receive calls from his disconnected cell phone number that produce only silence when I answer. I was 35 years old when Kyle disappeared, and we had been married for 7 years. He was a software engineer, methodical and careful in everything he did, and his annual hunting trip with his 3 closest friends was the one tradition he refused to compromise on, no matter how demanding his work schedule became. The group consisted of Kyle, his best friend since college named Brandon Liu, and 2 brothers, Mason and Garrett Whitmore, who owned a small construction company in Spokane. They had been making this trip together for 11 years, always to the same general area in the North Cascades, always during the second week of November when deer season was in full swing. They would drive up on Thursday afternoon, hike several miles into a remote basin they had scouted years earlier, set up camp and spend Friday and Saturday hunting before packing out on Sunday. They were experienced outdoorsmen, all of them, and they took safety seriously. They carried GPS devices, satellite phones, emergency beacons, first aid kits, and enough food and water for twice as long as they planned to be gone. Kyle had made this trip so many times that I never worried about him when he left. I trusted his competence and his caution. That trust, I have learned, was misplaced not because Kyle was careless, but because there are things in the mountains that competence and caution cannot protect you from. On Thursday, November 14th, Kyle kissed me goodbye in our driveway in Spokane, loaded his gear into Brandon's truck, and drove away with the others. He called me that evening from their campsite, as he always did, and everything seemed normal. On Friday evening, I expected another call, but it did not come. I told myself that perhaps they had stayed out hunting later than planned, or that the satellite phone battery had died, or that they had simply forgotten in the excitement of a successful day. I was not worried. On Saturday morning, when there was still no contact, I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. I called the Chelan County Sheriff's Office and explained the situation. They told me that 24 hours without contact did not constitute an emergency for a group of experienced hunters, and that I should wait until Sunday evening, their planned return time, before making a formal missing persons report. I waited. Sunday evening came and went with no word. At 8:00 p.m., I called the sheriff's office again, and this time they took my concern seriously. A search and rescue team was dispatched first thing Monday morning. Kyle had left detailed trip plans with me, including the coordinates of their intended campsite and the trails they planned to use, so the searchers knew exactly where to go. They reached the campsite by mid-morning and found a scene that defied explanation. The 4 tents were still standing, fully set up and securely staked. The campfire ring contained the remains of a fire that had been properly extinguished. Food was stored correctly in bear-proof containers hung from a tree. 4 hunting rifles, expensive and well-maintained, were leaning against a log as if the men had set them down, intending to pick them up again in a few minutes. Personal items were scattered around the campsite: backpacks, clothing, water bottles, a paperback novel, a deck of cards. Everything suggested that the men had been there, that they had settled in and made themselves comfortable, and then they had simply vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence or panic. It was as if they had stood up from whatever they were doing and walked away, leaving everything behind. The search expanded immediately. Teams with tracking dogs combed the surrounding forest looking for any sign of the four men. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment scanned the area from above. Volunteers from local hiking clubs and hunting organizations joined the effort, spreading out in coordinated search patterns. For 2 days they found nothing, not a single footprint or dropped item or any evidence that Kyle and his friends had left the immediate vicinity of the campsite. Then on Wednesday afternoon, a search team discovered Brandon Liu. He was approximately 6 miles from the campsite, sitting on the ground with his back against a tree, alive but unresponsive. His clothes were torn and dirty, his face scratched and bruised, his eyes wide and staring at nothing. When the rescuers approached him, he began to scream. They had to sedate him to get him out of the forest and to a hospital. I arrived at the hospital in Wenatchee as quickly as I could, desperate for answers, desperate to know where Kyle was and what had happened. Brandon was in a private room, restrained to the bed with a psychiatrist and 2 sheriff's deputies present. They allowed me to see him for a few minutes, though they warned me that he was not coherent and that his statements were not reliable. I will never forget what I saw when I walked into that room. Brandon, who I had known for over a decade, who had been the best man at our wedding, who was one of the most rational and grounded people I had ever met, was gone. The person in that bed looked like Brandon, but his eyes were empty and terrified in a way that suggested he had seen something that broke him fundamentally. When he saw me, he began to speak, the same words over and over in a hoarse whisper. They took the others. They were wearing our faces. They were wearing our faces. The psychiatrist gently explained that Brandon was experiencing a severe psychotic break, likely brought on by trauma and exposure, and that it would take time to determine what had actually happened to him and whether his memories could be trusted. Over the next several days, while search teams continued to scour the mountains for Kyle, Mason, and Garrett, psychiatrists attempted to interview Brandon and piece together his version of events. The story he told, when he could be coaxed into speaking, was consistent in its broad outlines but fragmentary and surreal in its details. He claimed that on Friday evening, as the 4 men sat around their campfire eating dinner, figures emerged from the forest. He described them as human-shaped but wrong in ways he could not articulate, moving with a strange gliding motion rather than walking. The figures, he said, looked exactly like the 4 of them. Same height, same build, same faces, same clothing. The duplicates stood at the edge of the firelight, silent and motionless, staring at the men with expressions that Brandon described as hungry. When Kyle stood up and called out, asking who they were and what they wanted, his duplicate smiled and gestured for Kyle to follow it into the trees. Kyle had begun walking toward his double as if compelled, and Mason and Garrett had done the same, each following their own duplicate into the darkness. Brandon claimed that he had broken free of whatever influence the figures exerted and had run, crashing through the underbrush in blind panic, running for hours until he collapsed from exhaustion. The authorities did not know what to make of Brandon's account. The prevailing theory was that he had suffered some kind of mental breakdown, possibly exacerbated by carbon monoxide poisoning from the campfire or from eating something toxic, and that his story was a trauma-induced delusion covering whatever had actually occurred. They continued to search for the 3 missing men, operating under the assumption that there had been an accident or a medical emergency and that Brandon's confused state had prevented him from leading rescuers to the others. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, no trace of Kyle, Mason, or Garrett was found. No bodies, no equipment, no clues. They had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Brandon was released from psychiatric care after 6 weeks, diagnosed with severe PTSD and delusional disorder. He moved back in with his parents and refused to speak to anyone about what had happened. I tried to visit him several times, hoping that he might remember some detail that could help locate Kyle. But his mother turned me away at the door, saying that seeing me only made Brandon worse. Then in February, 3 months after the disappearance, Brandon took his own life. He left a note, written in shaky handwriting that barely resembled his normal script. The note contained only one sentence: "They are still wearing their faces." The police investigated his death and concluded it was suicide brought on by survivor guilt and mental illness. They found no evidence linking his death to the disappearance of the other 3 men, and the case was essentially closed, listed as an unexplained disappearance with no leads and no suspects. I have not accepted that conclusion. I cannot accept it. Kyle is still missing along with Mason and Garrett, and no one seems interested in continuing the search or investigating the possibility that Brandon's story, as impossible as it sounds, might contain some kernel of truth. I have spent the past 5 years researching similar cases, looking for patterns or precedents that might explain what happened in those mountains. I have found more than I expected. There are dozens of documented cases of people vanishing in the Cascade wilderness under circumstances that defy rational explanation. Experienced hikers who disappear from well-traveled trails, hunters who leave their camps and are never seen again, entire groups who vanish without a trace. In some of these cases, witnesses report seeing figures in the forest that do not move quite right, or encountering people who look familiar but are somehow wrong, or feeling an overwhelming compulsion to follow someone or something deeper into the trees. The accounts are dismissed as folklore or hallucination, but there are too many of them, too many common elements for me to believe they are all delusions. And then there are the phone calls. Starting about 6 months after Kyle disappeared, I began receiving calls from his cell phone number. The phone itself was never found, and the account has been disconnected since December 2019, so these calls should not be possible. They come at irregular intervals, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes several in a single night. When I answer, there is only silence, but it is not the empty silence of a dead line. It is the silence of someone listening, waiting, breathing on the other end. I have reported the calls to the police, to the phone company, to anyone who might be able to trace them or explain them, but no one can. The technology does not exist to spoof a disconnected number in the way these calls appear to originate. They simply happen, impossible but real, and each time my phone rings with Kyle's number, I answer it hoping that this time he will speak, that he will tell me where he is and how to find him. He never does. The silence continues for 30 seconds, sometimes a minute, and then the call ends. I still live in our house in Spokane. I still sleep in the bed we shared. I have not removed any of Kyle's belongings or changed anything about our home because I cannot accept that he is not coming back. The official conclusion is that Kyle Whitmore, along with Mason Whitmore and Garrett Whitmore, died of exposure or accident in the North Cascades in November 2019, their bodies lost to the wilderness and likely never to be recovered. I am listed as a widow, though no death certificate has been issued, but I do not believe Kyle is dead. I believe he is somewhere in those mountains, and I believe that whatever took him is still there, waiting in the fog and the trees, wearing faces that do not belong to it. I believe Brandon Liu saw something real. Something that shattered his mind so completely that death seemed preferable to living with the memory of it. And I believe that one day my phone will ring with Kyle's number, and this time when I answer, I will hear his voice, and he will tell me what happened to him in the darkness beyond the campfire light. The sound of 40 voices chanting in unison is a thing that stays with you, burrowing into your memory like an insect that lays eggs beneath your skin. It is not quite singing and not quite speaking, but something in between. A rhythmic vocalization that seems designed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the oldest parts of your brain. The parts that existed before language, before civilization, before we learned to walk upright and pretend we were separate from the animals. I heard that sound on a cold October night in 2017 in a forest clearing near the town of Granite Falls, Washington. And it still wakes me from sleep. Still echoes in my head when I am alone and the world is quiet. I was 26 years old at the time, recently released from a residential treatment program for opioid addiction, and I had moved to Granite Falls specifically because it was small and remote and far from the people and places that had enabled my worst behaviors. I rented a one-room cabin at the edge of town, a structure that was barely more than a shed with a wood stove and a sleeping loft, and I found work at a hardware store stocking shelves and loading lumber for customers. It was simple work, honest work, and for the first time in years I felt like I might be building something resembling a normal life. The town itself had fewer than 4,000 residents, most of them loggers or retirees, and the community had a tight-knit quality that I found both comforting and slightly suffocating. People knew each other, knew each other's business, and newcomers were regarded with polite suspicion until they proved themselves trustworthy. My landlord was a woman in her 70s named Pauline Henderson, though she insisted that I call her Sister Pauline, a title I assumed was left over from some past involvement with a religious order. She lived in the main house on the property, a larger cabin about 50 yards from mine, and she checked on me frequently, bringing homemade bread and jars of preserves, asking about my work and my recovery with a grandmotherly concern that felt genuine. She never asked about the details of my addiction or my past mistakes, for which I was grateful, and she seemed content to accept me as I was presenting myself. A young man trying to start over and make better choices. About 2 months after I moved in, Sister Pauline invited me to what she called a community gathering. She explained that there was a group of local residents, perhaps 40 or 50 people, who met regularly in the forest to pray and give thanks for the blessings of nature, and to seek guidance from what she termed the old spirits of the mountains. I told her politely that I was not particularly religious and that I appreciated the invitation but would probably decline. She smiled in a way that suggested she had expected this response and told me that the gathering was not about religion in the conventional sense, that it was more of a spiritual fellowship, and that newcomers to the community were always welcome to observe. She said it would be good for me to meet more people from the town, to start building connections and friendships, and that there would be food and music and a bonfire. The way she described it made it sound harmless, almost wholesome, and I found myself agreeing to attend more out of a desire to be polite than any genuine interest in spiritual fellowship. The gathering was scheduled for the following Saturday evening, and Sister Pauline offered to drive me to the location, which she said was about 20 minutes outside of town on private land. We left just before sunset, driving along increasingly narrow dirt roads that wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar. The forest on either side of the road was dark and impenetrable, and I began to feel a creeping unease that I could not rationally justify. Sister Pauline seemed to sense my nervousness and chatted pleasantly about the history of the group, explaining that it had been meeting for over 30 years and that many of the members were second or third generation participants whose parents and grandparents had also been part of what she called the Evergreen Faithful. The name struck me as odd, more like the title of a cult than a casual spiritual group, but I kept this observation to myself. We arrived at a clearing deep in the forest just as the last light was fading from the sky. There were perhaps a dozen vehicles parked in a rough semicircle around the clearing, and I could see people moving in the gathering darkness, their forms illuminated by the orange glow of a large bonfire that had already been lit in the center of the space. Sister Pauline parked and led me toward the fire, where I was greeted by smiling faces and firm handshakes. The people were of all ages, from children who looked no older than 5 or 6 to elderly men and women who moved with the careful deliberation of those whose bodies had begun to fail them They were dressed in ordinary clothes, jeans and flannel shirts and hiking boots. But as the darkness deepened, many of them produced robes from bags and vehicles, simple garments of undyed linen that they pulled on over their regular clothing. Sister Pauline handed me a robe as well, explaining that it was traditional to wear them during the ceremony, and I put it on feeling ridiculous and increasingly uncomfortable. The gathering began innocuously enough. People stood in a loose circle around the bonfire, and an elderly man with a white beard stepped forward to offer what sounded like a standard invocation of gratitude for the harvest and the health of the community. There were murmured responses from the assembled group, a call and response pattern that reminded me of church services I had attended as a child. Then the singing began, or what I initially interpreted as singing. It was a low droning sound, a single note held and sustained by multiple voices, and it gradually built in volume and complexity as people added harmonics and variations. The sound washed over me, and I felt a strange disorientation, as if the ground beneath my feet had become unsteady. I looked around and saw that everyone's eyes were closed, their faces turned upward toward the canopy of trees that surrounded the clearing. And I wondered what they were seeing or feeling that I could not access. The chanting continued for what might have been 10 minutes or might have been an hour. I had lost all sense of time, and when it finally stopped, the silence that followed felt oppressive and wrong. Then the elderly man spoke again, but this time his words were different. He spoke of the voice in the trees, of the ancient intelligence that dwelled in the forest and demanded reverence and sacrifice. He spoke of the outside, which I understood to mean the world beyond the forest, the world of cities and technology and disconnection from nature, and he described it as a corrupting force, a poison that infected those who were exposed to it. He said that the evergreen faithful had been chosen to remain pure, to resist the contamination of the outside, and to offer appeasement to the voice so that it would continue to protect and sustain the community. The language was archaic and florid, and I might have dismissed it as harmless eccentricity except for what happened next. Two men emerged from the shadows beyond the firelight, dragging between them a third person whose hands were bound behind his back and whose mouth was gagged with cloth. The bound man was young, perhaps in his early 20s, with terror visible in his wide eyes. He was struggling weakly, and his muffled cries were barely audible above the crackling of the fire. The elderly man gestured toward the bound figure and announced that this person had been touched by the outside, that he had brought corruption into the community, and that he must be returned to the soil so that the voice could cleanse him and restore balance. I felt my stomach drop, felt every muscle in my body tense with the sudden understanding that I was witnessing something terrible, and that I needed to leave immediately. I looked at Sister Pauline, expecting to see shock or alarm on her face, but instead she was smiling, her expression serene and satisfied. I took a step backward, and she reached out and gripped my arm with surprising strength. She told me quietly that it was important for me to witness this, to understand the truth of the evergreen faithful, and that once I had seen the ceremony, I would be welcomed as a full member of the community. I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened, and I realized that other people had moved behind me, blocking my path to the vehicles. The bound man was forced to his knees at the edge of the fire, and several members of the group began digging a shallow pit in the soft earth nearby. The reality of what was about to happen crashed over me like a wave. They were going to bury this person alive, were going to commit murder as part of some deranged ritual, and I was being held here to watch. I made my decision in a fraction of a second. I twisted hard, breaking Sister Pauline's grip, and lunged toward the bound man. I collided with one of the men holding him, knocking him off balance, and grabbed the young man by his bound arms, hauling him to his feet. The entire clearing erupted into chaos. People were shouting, rushing toward me, and I could hear Sister Pauline's voice above the others. commanding them to stop me, to bring us both back. I fumbled with the rope around the man's wrists, managed to loosen it enough for him to pull free, and then we were running. We crashed into the forest, branches whipping our faces, roots catching our feet, the robes tangling around our legs. Behind us, I could hear the congregation giving chase, their voices raised in that terrible chant, a hunting call that echoed through the trees. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes, stumbling through the darkness with no idea where we were going, driven only by the primal need to put distance between ourselves and the clearing. The young man, whose name I still did not know, pulled the gag from his mouth and gasped that we needed to reach the highway, that if we could flag down a car, we would be safe. We navigated by keeping the faint glow of the bonfire behind us, moving in what we hoped was a straight line away from the gathering. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded, and we slowed to a walk, our lungs burning, our legs shaking with exhaustion. We found the highway just as dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky, and we collapsed on the shoulder of the road, covered in dirt and scratches, still wearing the ridiculous linen robes. A logging truck stopped for us, the driver taking one look at our appearance and immediately calling 911 on his radio. The police arrived within 20 minutes, and we were taken to the hospital in Everett, where we were examined and interviewed by detectives. I told them everything I had witnessed, described the location as best I could, gave them the names of everyone I knew who had been present, including Sister Pauline. The young man, whose name was Daniel Cooper, told a similar story. He explained that he had grown up in the Evergreen Faithful, that his parents were members, and that when he turned 18 and announced his intention to leave the community and attend college, he had been declared corrupted by the outside. He had been held captive for 3 days before the gathering, told repeatedly that he would be purified through the ceremony and that his sacrifice would strengthen the community. The police investigation was thorough and frustrating. They found the clearing where the gathering had taken place, identified by the remains of the bonfire and the partially dug pit, but there was no other evidence. No vehicles, no robes, no people. They interviewed residents of Granite Falls, including Sister Pauline Henderson, and every single person denied any knowledge of a group called the Evergreen Faithful. Sister Pauline claimed that I had suffered a relapse, that I had been behaving erratically, and that she was deeply concerned about my mental health. Daniel's parents insisted that their son had run away from home weeks earlier, and that they had been searching for him desperately. There were no charges filed, no arrests made. The official conclusion was that Daniel and I had both experienced some kind of shared psychotic episode, possibly drug-induced, and that while the story we told was vivid and consistent, it was not supported by physical evidence. I moved out of Granite Falls immediately, relocating to Seattle, where I found a new apartment and a new job. Daniel did the same, though we have remained in occasional contact. 3 months after the incident, I received a letter at my Seattle address. It had no return address and no postmark, as if it had been hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. The trees remember you. You cannot run from the voice. We are waiting for your return. The handwriting was Sister Pauline's. I recognized it from the rent receipts she used to give me, and the message sent a chill through me that has never fully dissipated. I reported the letter to the police, but without a traceable origin, there was nothing they could do. I have received 3 more letters since then, always with the same message, always delivered in a way that leaves no trail. And I know with a certainty that overrides logic and reason that the Evergreen Faithful are still out there in those forests, still holding their gatherings, still serving whatever dark thing they call the voice in the trees. I know that somewhere in those mountains, Daniel Cooper's parents and dozens of others are waiting for their corrupted children to return so they can complete the ceremony that we interrupted. And I know that no amount of distance or time will ever make me feel truly safe from them, because they have decided that I belong to them, that I witnessed their truth and that sooner or later they will come to bring me home. I do not expect you to believe what I am about to tell you because I am not sure I believe it myself. There are moments, usually late at night when sleep will not come, when I convince myself that what happened to me in the Alpine Lakes wilderness in September 2020 was nothing more than a hallucination brought on by dehydration and exhaustion. That my mind created a narrative to explain away my own poor judgment and navigational errors. But then I remember the specifics, the details that my imagination could not have conjured, and I am forced to confront the possibility that I experienced something that exists outside the boundaries of rational explanation. I was 31 years old at the time, working as a civil engineer for a firm in Eugene, Oregon, and I had been backpacking solo for over a decade. I was not a novice hiker who ventured unprepared into dangerous terrain. I carried proper equipment. I filed detailed trip plans with the ranger station. I understood weather patterns and wilderness safety protocols. I tell you this not to absolve myself of responsibility for what happened, but to emphasize that I did not approach that trip carelessly. The Alpine Lakes wilderness is a vast area spanning over 400,000 acres in the central Cascades of Washington, characterized by rugged peaks, pristine lakes, and dense forests of mountain hemlock and subalpine fir. I had chosen a 4-day loop trail that would take me through some of the more remote sections of the wilderness, far from the popular day hiking destinations that attract crowds during the summer months. September is an ideal time for backpacking in the Cascades after the peak tourist season has ended but before the weather turns truly dangerous. I started my hike on a Thursday morning from a trailhead off Highway 2, carrying a 40-pound pack that contained my tent, sleeping bag, food for 5 days, water filtration system, first aid kit, GPS unit, compass, paper maps, and various other supplies. The first day of hiking was unremarkable. I covered approximately 8 miles, climbing steadily through old-growth forest and crossing several clear streams, and I made camp in a designated site near a small alpine lake. I ate a freeze-dried meal, hung my food in a bear bag, and slept soundly under a sky so thick with stars that it looked like spilled milk. The second day began with perfect conditions: clear skies, mild temperatures, and a well-marked trail that wound through meadows still dotted with late-season wildflowers. I hiked for approximately 3 hours, stopping occasionally to take photographs and to consult my GPS, which showed me progressing along the planned route exactly as expected. Then, sometime around midday, I noticed that the trail markers had become less frequent. This was not immediately alarming, as remote trails in the Cascades are often minimally maintained, but I slowed my pace and paid closer attention to my navigation. My GPS continued to show me on the correct trail, so I continued walking, trusting the technology more than my growing sense that something felt wrong about the landscape around me. The forest had become denser, the canopy thicker, and the sunlight that filtered through the trees had taken on a strange greenish quality that I attributed to the angle of the sun. After another hour of hiking, I stopped to check my GPS again and felt the first real spike of alarm. The device showed me as being approximately 2 miles off my planned route, in an area where, according to my paper map, there should be no trail at all. I assumed the GPS had lost satellite signal and was displaying incorrect data, so I pulled out my compass and attempted to orient myself using landmarks. But the landscape around me was featureless, just endless stands of identical trees and no visible ridgelines or peaks that I could use for triangulation. I decided to backtrack, to return to the last point where I was certain of my location. But after walking for 30 minutes in what I believed was the direction I had come from, nothing looked familiar. The trail, such as it was, had disappeared completely, and I found myself pushing through underbrush that showed no sign of having been traveled recently. I will not describe the panic that set in at that moment, because anyone who has been truly lost in the wilderness knows that particular flavor of fear. I forced myself to stop moving, to sit down and think rationally about my situation. I still had plenty of food and water. I had shelter and warm clothing. I had a whistle and a signal mirror and an emergency beacon that would summon help if I activated it. The smart thing to do was to stay where I was, to set up camp, and to use the beacon to call for rescue. But I was not quite ready to admit that I needed rescuing. Not when I had years of experience and quality equipment and the trailhead was supposedly only a few miles away. I decided to hike downhill, following the basic principle that water flows down and that following water will eventually lead to a road or a settlement. I picked a direction and started walking, and that is when things became truly strange. I found the campsite after approximately 2 hours of downhill bushwhacking. It was a small clearing in the trees, with a fire ring made of blackened stones, and scattered around the site were items that appeared to have been abandoned recently. A sleeping bag still in its stuff sack, several cans of food, a journal with a water-damaged cover, and a first aid kit. The items looked expensive and well-maintained, not the kind of things a hiker would leave behind voluntarily. I approached cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was nearby, but there was no response. I picked up the journal, thinking it might contain information about the location or the person who had left these items, and when I opened it, my hands started shaking. The journal was filled with handwritten entries, and the handwriting was mine. Not similar to mine, not reminiscent of my style, but identical in every detail, the same loops and slants and pressure patterns that I had been making since I learned cursive in elementary school. The entries described a backpacking trip through the Alpine Lakes wilderness, and they matched my current trip in almost every detail. The same trailhead, the same planned route, the same observations about weather and wildlife. But the dates were wrong. The journal entries were dated September 2015, 5 years earlier. I had not visited the Alpine Lakes wilderness in 2015. I had not been to Washington State at all that year. I sat in that abandoned campsite for a long time, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rational explanations that my mind generated and discarded in rapid succession all felt inadequate. Someone was playing an elaborate prank. I was hallucinating due to carbon monoxide exposure or a brain tumor or undiagnosed psychosis. I was dreaming and would wake up at any moment. None of these explanations felt true. The journal was real, the handwriting was real, and the growing sense of wrongness that permeated the forest around me was real. I decided to continue hiking downhill, carrying the journal with me, and I had gone perhaps another mile when I heard the footsteps. They were behind me, matching my pace exactly, the sound of boots crushing dried needles and small twigs. I stopped walking, and the footsteps stopped. I called out, asking if anyone was there, and received no answer. I started walking again, faster this time, and the footsteps resumed, maintaining the same distance behind me. I did not want to look back. Some instinct, some primal recognition of danger told me that turning around would be a mistake. I walked faster, then broke into a jog, and the footsteps behind me accelerated as well, never getting closer but never falling behind. Then I heard a second set of footsteps, these ones circling around to my left, and a third set moving through the trees on my right. I was being herded, driven in a specific direction by something that I could hear but not see. I ran. I abandoned all pretense of navigation or caution and simply ran downhill, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, my pack slamming against my back with every stride. The footsteps followed, multiplying until it sounded like an entire group was pursuing me, and I could hear breathing now, ragged and close, though when I risked a glance over my shoulder, I saw nothing. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed next to a stream, sobbing and gasping for air, and the footsteps stopped. The forest was silent except for the sound of running water and my own labored breathing. I lay there for several minutes waiting for something to emerge from the trees, but nothing came. When I finally sat up and looked around, I saw fresh boot prints in the soft mud beside the stream. They were my prints, the distinctive tread pattern of my hiking boots, but they formed a complete circle around the spot where I had collapsed. I had never left that spot. The prints should not have been there. I filled my water bottles with shaking hands and I started walking again, this time following the stream downward as I had originally planned. The stream led me to a dirt road after what might have been 3 hours or might have been 10. Time had lost all meaning. I stumbled onto the pavement and collapsed in the middle of the road, and I was picked up 20 minutes later by a park ranger who happened to be driving past. The ranger took me to the hospital in Wenatchee where I was treated for dehydration and minor injuries. I told the medical staff that I had gotten lost and disoriented, but I did not mention the journal or the footsteps or the circling boot prints. They would have thought I was experiencing a psychiatric emergency, and perhaps they would have been right. The ranger who found me told me that I had emerged onto a Forest Service road approximately 40 miles from where I had started my hike, in a completely different drainage than my planned route. He could not explain how I had traveled that distance in the time I had been missing, and he seemed troubled by my inability to describe the route I had taken. After I was released from the hospital, I contacted the sheriff's office and requested that they search the area where I had found the abandoned campsite. I provided them with the journal as evidence and tried to explain what I had experienced, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They conducted a search anyway, more as a courtesy than anything else, and they found nothing. No campsite, no abandoned gear, no journal except the one I had brought with me. They kept the journal as part of their report, and I never saw it again. I later tried to follow up, to obtain copies of the report or to speak with the deputies who had conducted the search, but I was told that no such report existed in their system. I have spent years trying to research what happened to me. I have read hundreds of accounts of missing persons and unexplained disappearances in the Cascades, and I have found disturbing patterns. There are documented cases of hikers who disappear from well-traveled trails and whose bodies are found years later in locations that make no logical sense, miles away from where they should have been. There are stories of people who claim to have encountered doppelgangers in the wilderness, identical copies of themselves or their companions that behave in strange ways. There are Native American legends about the forests of the Pacific Northwest, about spirits that lead travelers astray, and places where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. I do not know if any of this is connected to my experience, or if I am simply looking for patterns in randomness, because the alternative, accepting that I hallucinated the entire event, is somehow more terrifying than believing it was real. What I do know is this. I found a journal written in my handwriting, describing a trip I never took. I was pursued through the forest by something that left no trace of itself except the sound of footsteps. I traveled 40 miles in a direction that should have been impossible given the terrain and the time available. And somewhere in the Alpine Lakes wilderness, there may be an abandoned campsite with my name in a journal, waiting for the next lost hiker to stumble across it and realize that their story has already been written. The smell inside the cabin was copper and pine, a combination that should not exist together but which filled my nostrils the moment I pushed open the heavy wooden door. It is a scent that has never left me, that returns without warning when I am in grocery stores or restaurants or lying in bed trying to sleep. And when it does, I am transported instantly back to that January night in 2016 when I learned that mercy can be the cruelest word in the English language. I was 38 years old at the time, working as a financial analyst in Bend, Oregon, and my girlfriend Lauren Stokes and I had planned a winter backpacking trip into a remote section of the Deschutes National Forest. We were both experienced winter campers, comfortable with snow and cold, and we had invested in high-quality gear specifically for this kind of expedition. The forecast called for clear weather, temperatures in the low 20s at night but manageable with proper equipment, and we anticipated a peaceful weekend in the wilderness away from the noise and stress of our daily lives. We started our hike on a Friday afternoon, parking at a Forest Service trailhead, and heading into the backcountry with packs that contained everything we would need for 3 days. The trail was well marked and relatively flat for the first few miles, winding through stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, and we made good progress despite the foot of snow that covered the ground. We planned to camp near a frozen lake about 7 miles from the trailhead, a spot we had visited the previous summer and which we knew offered good tent sites and spectacular views. But weather in the mountains is unpredictable, and what the forecast had promised as clear skies transformed into a blizzard shortly after we crossed the 3-mile mark. The snow began falling heavily, driven by winds that seemed to come from every direction at once, and visibility dropped to almost nothing within minutes. We discussed turning back, but we had already covered too much distance and the storm was intensifying behind us. Our only option was to push forward and hope to reach the lake before conditions became completely unmanageable. We did not make it to the lake. After another hour of struggling through knee-deep snow with the wind tearing at our clothing and the temperature plummeting, we were forced to admit that continuing was dangerous and potentially fatal. We needed shelter immediately, and we needed to get out of the storm. Lauren spotted the cabin first, a dark shape barely visible through the swirling snow about 50 yards off the trail. It was a small structure, perhaps 15 feet on each side, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. A hand-painted wooden sign hung above the door, and when we got close enough, I could read the single word painted there in faded red letters: Mercy. I assumed it was the name of the cabin, perhaps left by whoever had built it decades earlier. And I felt a surge of relief that we had found shelter. Lauren said something about how the cabin was a merciful discovery, how we had been saved by blind luck, and I agreed with her. We had no idea how wrong we were. The door was not locked, which was common for remote backcountry cabins that served as emergency shelters for stranded hikers. I pushed it open and we stumbled inside, shaking snow from our clothing and dropping our packs with groans of relief. The interior was larger than it had appeared from outside. A single room with a stone fireplace along one wall, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and what looked like built-in bunks along another wall. There were supplies stacked neatly in one corner: split firewood, boxes of candles, several gallon jugs of water, and a plastic bin that contained canned food and a manual can opener. Someone had clearly been maintaining this cabin as an emergency refuge, stocking it with the essentials needed for survival. I felt grateful to whoever had taken on this responsibility, and I made a mental note to leave a donation and a thank you note when we departed. It was while I was examining the supplies that I first noticed the messages scratched into the walls. They were everywhere, hundreds of them carved into the logs with knives or sharp rocks, overlapping and intersecting until some sections of wall looked like abstract art. Most of them were brief, just a few words. He is watching. Do not sleep. The mercy is a lie. Run before dark. He wants to help. Do not let him in. I called Lauren over and we stood together reading the messages, feeling our relief curdle into unease. Some of the carvings were old, the wood around them darkened with age, but others looked fresh, the exposed wood still pale. I tried to rationalize what we were seeing, suggesting that perhaps this was some kind of joke or tradition, that hikers who stayed here left dramatic messages to scare future visitors. But even as I said it, I did not believe it. The messages had a quality of desperation, of genuine terror that could not be faked. Lauren suggested that we should leave, that we should continue hiking despite the storm. But I convinced her that we would be safer staying put. The blizzard outside was worsening, and attempting to navigate in those conditions would be suicidal. The messages were disturbing, but they were just words, I argued, and we had warm sleeping bags and enough food and a solid roof over our heads. We could build a fire in the fireplace, warm ourselves, eat a meal, and get some rest. In the morning, the storm would clear and we would hike back to the trailhead. What I did not say, what I barely admitted to myself, was that I was terrified of going back out into that storm, and I was willing to ignore the warnings carved into the walls because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. We spent the next few hours attempting to make ourselves comfortable. I built a fire using the stacked wood, and it caught easily, filling the cabin with flickering light and welcome heat. We heated water and prepared freeze-dried meals, and we spread our sleeping bags on the bunks, trying not to look too closely at the messages carved into the wood near our heads. We talked about mundane things, work and friends and plans for future trips, but the conversation felt forced and hollow. Neither of us mentioned the messages again, as if by not speaking of them we could make them less real. As darkness fell outside and the wind screamed around the corners of the cabin, we prepared to sleep. I remember Lauren asking me if I thought we should take shifts keeping watch, and I remember dismissing the suggestion as paranoid. I was very stupid. I woke sometime after midnight to find Lauren standing at the small window that faced the front of the cabin, her back to me, completely motionless. I called her name, but she did not respond. I got up and approached her, and when I touched her shoulder, she spoke without turning around. She said in a voice that was flat and strange that he was out there, that he wanted to help us, that we needed to let him in. I looked over her shoulder through the window and saw a figure standing in the snow about 20 feet from the cabin. It was the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, but the details were wrong in ways I could not immediately articulate. The proportions were off, the limbs too long, the head too large, and it stood with an absolute stillness that no living person could maintain. As I watched, it began to move toward the cabin, not walking but gliding across the snow without leaving footprints, and I felt every hair on my body stand up. Lauren said again that we needed to let him in, that he had been waiting for us, that he offered mercy. Her hand reached for the door and I grabbed her wrist, pulling her away from the window. She fought me with surprising strength, her face blank and her eyes unfocused, and I realized that she was not fully conscious, that something had taken hold of her mind and was using her like a puppet. The figure outside had reached the door and I could hear it now. A scraping sound like fingernails on wood, rhythmic and patient. Lauren was screaming at me, saying that I was hurting her, that the man outside could help us if we would just open the door, that refusing his mercy was the worst thing we could do. I dragged her away from the door and pushed one of the heavy wooden chairs against it, barricading it as best I could. The scraping continued for what felt like hours, and with it came a voice, soft and reasonable, speaking from just outside the door. It offered us warmth and safety and guidance back to the trailhead. It promised that if we would just open the door, everything would be fine, that we would never be cold or lost or afraid again. The voice was male, but with an odd resonance, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. Lauren had stopped fighting me and was now curled on the floor, sobbing and begging me to let him in, saying that she was so tired and so cold and that she just wanted it to be over. I held onto her and tried to block out the voice, but it was insidious, working its way into my thoughts, suggesting that maybe Lauren was right, that maybe I was being unreasonable, that opening the door would solve all of our problems. Then something broke through one of the windows, a hand, or what looked like a hand, covered in deep scars and old dried blood. with fingers that were too long and bent at wrong angles. It reached inside, groping blindly, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the flare gun from my pack, the emergency signal device we carried in case we needed to summon rescue, and I fired it directly at the window. The flare exploded in a burst of brilliant red light and sulfurous smoke, and the hand withdrew with a sound that might have been a scream or might have been laughter. The scraping stopped. The voice stopped. The cabin was silent except for Lauren's ragged breathing and the crackling of the fire. We did not sleep for the rest of that night. We sat together on one of the bunks, holding each other and watching the door and windows, waiting for the thing outside to return. It did not. When dawn finally came and gray light began to filter through the windows, the storm had passed. We packed our gear with shaking hands and stepped outside into a world of pristine snow and clear blue sky. There were no footprints around the cabin except our own from the previous evening. The window I had shot the flare through was intact, showing no sign of damage. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the entire night had been a shared hallucination. We hiked back to the trailhead without speaking, and we drove back to Bend in silence. Lauren went to stay with her sister that night, telling me she needed space to process what had happened, and I agreed. But when I tried to contact her the next day, she did not answer. Her sister told me that Lauren had no memory of the events in the cabin, that her last clear memory was of us hiking through the storm, and that everything after that was blank. She did not remember standing at the window or fighting me or begging me to open the door. The sister suggested gently that perhaps I should seek counseling, that the stress of the storm and the fear of being trapped might have caused me to experience a psychotic episode. I tried to explain about the messages carved into the walls, about the figure in the snow, but even to my own ears it sounded insane. 3 weeks later, after I had failed repeatedly to reach Lauren, I contacted the sheriff's office and asked them to investigate the cabin. I provided them with coordinates and a detailed description, and they promised to send a deputy to check it out. They called me back 2 days later and told me that they had found the structure. It was a Forest Service maintenance shed used for storing equipment, and it had been broken into recently. The lock on the door had been forced and some supplies were missing. There was evidence that someone had sheltered there during the recent storm. They asked me if I had taken anything, and I said no, and they seemed satisfied. They made no mention of messages carved into the walls, and when I asked about them specifically, they told me there were no carvings, just standard graffiti and some vulgar drawings. They suggested that I had confused this shed with a different structure. A month after that, I received a call from the Deschutes County Medical Examiner. They had discovered human remains in the forest, buried in a shallow crawl space beneath the floor of an old cabin that matched the location I had reported. 6 sets of remains in various stages of decomposition, ranging in age from a few months to several decades. They were able to identify 4 of the victims from dental records and personal effects found with the bodies. All of them had been reported missing while hiking in the area, disappearances stretching back over 20 years. The examiner asked me if I had seen anything unusual during my stay in the cabin, and I told them everything. They listened politely and took notes, but I could hear the skepticism in their questions. The investigation into the deaths remains open, and no suspect has been identified. The prevailing theory is that a serial killer used the cabin to lure stranded hikers, offering them shelter and then murdering them. Though how this killer managed to operate for decades without being caught is unclear. Lauren and I have not spoken since that winter. She refuses to see me or take my calls, and mutual friends have told me that she has moved to California and has started a new life. I have tried to move on as well, finding a new job and a new apartment, and attempting to convince myself that what I experienced was some combination of exhaustion, hypothermia, and trauma-induced delusion. But then I receive a postcard in the mail, Always with no message, just a photograph of a cabin in the woods with a sign above the door that reads, Mercy. The postcards are postmarked from different towns across Oregon and Washington, places I have never been, and they arrive every few months, regular as clockwork. I have reported them to the police, but without a clear threat, they cannot take action. I keep every postcard in a box under my bed, and I have counted them recently. There are 18 so far, and they show 18 different cabins, each one with a different name but the same message. Mercy, salvation, refuge, haven. I do not know who is sending them or why, but I know what they mean. They mean that whatever was in that cabin is still out there, still waiting, still offering mercy to lost travelers who do not understand that mercy is just another word for damnation. Routine and safety can make you blind to danger, and I learned that lesson too late on a Thursday morning in March of 2021. I had spent the previous 44 years of my life believing that familiarity bred security, that knowing your surroundings and following predictable patterns would keep you safe from the chaos and violence that seemed to afflict other people in other places. I was wrong, and my mistake nearly cost me everything. I lived in Vancouver, Washington, a suburb of Portland separated from the larger city by the Columbia River, and I worked as a nurse practitioner at a family medicine clinic. My life was ordered and pleasant, filled with the comfortable rhythms of work and home and exercise, and I took pride in the stability I had created for myself after a difficult divorce 3 years earlier. Every morning before work, I would go for a run along a forest trail that wound through a wooded area near my neighborhood, a 3-mile loop that I had completed thousands of times over the past decade. I knew every turn, every tree, every place where roots broke through the packed dirt surface. I knew the other regular users of the trail, the elderly man who walked his golden retriever at precisely 6:30 a.m., the young couple who ran together holding hands, the woman with the elaborate tattoos who always wore bright pink headphones. We were a community of strangers bound together by our shared routine, and their familiar faces made me feel safe even when I was running alone in the pre-dawn darkness. On that particular Thursday, I began my run at 6 a.m. as usual, wearing my standard cold weather gear, black leggings, a long-sleeve technical shirt, a lightweight jacket, and a headlamp that cast a narrow beam of light on the trail ahead. The morning was cold and damp, typical for early spring in the Pacific Northwest, and a light fog hung in the trees, reducing visibility to perhaps 30 yards. I had been running for about 10 minutes when I noticed the woman ahead of me. She was wearing a bright yellow windbreaker that stood out vividly against the gray-green background of the forest, and she was jogging at a pace that was slightly slower than mine. I assumed she was another regular user of the trail whom I had not encountered before, perhaps someone whose schedule had recently changed. And I decided to catch up to her and say good morning, to welcome her to our informal community of early risers. I increased my pace, closing the distance between us, but no matter how fast I ran, she remained exactly the same distance ahead of me. It was as if she was matching my speed precisely, accelerating whenever I did, but never quite pulling away. After several minutes of this strange chase, I called out to her, a friendly greeting, but she did not respond or turn around. I called out again, louder this time, and again there was no acknowledgement. I told myself that she must be wearing headphones, that she was lost in music or a podcast, and could not hear me, but some part of me recognized that this explanation did not feel right. There was something odd about the way she moved, a fluidity to her stride that seemed unnatural, and I began to feel the first stirrings of unease. The woman left the main trail, turning onto a narrow side path that led deeper into the forest, away from the residential areas and toward a section of dense undergrowth that I had never explored. I slowed down, uncertain whether to follow, but my concern for her safety overrode my caution. The side path was not an official trail, just a gap in the vegetation that might have been made by deer or other wildlife, and it seemed like a dangerous place to run in the dim morning light. I called out one more time, asking if she was all right, if she knew where she was going, and when she did not respond, I made the decision to follow her. I thought perhaps she was lost, disoriented, maybe suffering from some kind of medical emergency or psychological crisis, and as a medical professional, I felt a responsibility to help. I pushed through the underbrush, branches scraping against my jacket, following the flash of yellow that appeared and disappeared in the fog ahead. The woman was moving faster now, no longer jogging but running at a full sprint, and I struggled to keep up. My heart was pounding and my breath came in gasps, not just from the physical exertion but from a growing sense that something was very wrong. The forest around me had become unfamiliar, the trees closer together and darker, and I realized I had gone much farther from the main trail than I had intended. I stopped, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath and orient myself, and when I looked up, the woman in the yellow jacket was gone. The forest was silent except for my own labored breathing and the distant sound of traffic from the highway that ran parallel to the trail system. I found the jacket hanging from a low branch about 10 feet in front of me. It was draped carefully over the branch, as if someone had placed it there deliberately, and when I approached it, I saw that the pockets were turned inside out. In one pocket was a photograph printed on glossy photo paper, and when I picked it up, my hands began to shake. The photograph showed me jogging on the trail, taken from behind, my distinctive jacket and headlamp clearly visible. The image had been printed recently, the paper still crisp and unmarked, and I had no idea who had taken it or how long they had been following me. I looked around wildly, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was watching me at that moment, but I saw nothing. The fog had grown thicker, reducing visibility to just a few yards, and the silence felt oppressive and threatening. I heard the footsteps then, coming from somewhere behind me, the unmistakable sound of someone running on soft ground. I spun around but saw no one, yet the footsteps continued, matching my rhythm, exactly as if someone was running in place just out of sight. I started backing away, still holding the photograph, and the footsteps followed. I began to run, abandoning any attempt to navigate logically and simply crashing through the forest in what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. And the footsteps stayed with me, always the same distance behind, never getting closer but never falling back. It was the most terrifying sound I have ever heard. Those footsteps that should not have existed, pursuing me through fog and trees with mechanical precision. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 20 minutes, my lungs burning and my legs cramping until I finally burst out of the forest and onto the paved parking lot where I had left my car. I fumbled with my keys, got the door open, and locked myself inside, gasping and sobbing. The footsteps had stopped when I reached the parking lot, cutting off abruptly as if they had hit an invisible barrier at the tree line. I sat in my car for a long time, waiting for my heart rate to return to normal, and then I drove directly to the police station. The officers who took my report were professional and concerned, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes when I described the woman in the yellow jacket and the footsteps that followed me. They asked if I had been taking any medications, if I had a history of anxiety or panic disorders, if there were any reasons I might be feeling paranoid or stressed. I gave them the photograph, the only physical evidence of what had happened, and they promised to review security footage from trail cameras that monitored the area. They advised me to vary my running route and to consider carrying pepper spray or a personal alarm. 3 days later, I received a call from the detective who had taken my statement. He told me that they had reviewed all available camera footage from the morning in question, and that the footage showed me running alone on the main trail, and then leaving the trail and running into the forest. There was no woman in a yellow jacket visible in any of the footage. However, he added, his voice careful and measured, there was something else. In several frames of the video, there appeared to be a blurred figure behind me, approximately 10 to 15 feet back. That matched my movements exactly. The figure was too distorted to make out any details, and the technical team believed it was probably a glitch in the recording system, but they thought I should know about it. He asked if I wanted to come in and view the footage myself, and I declined. I did not want to see it. I did not want confirmation that I had been followed by something that should not have existed. I stopped running on that trail. I found a new route, one that stayed entirely in residential neighborhoods with good lighting and constant traffic, and I never ran alone in the early morning darkness again. For several months, I convinced myself that I had been the victim of a prank, that someone with a sick sense of humor had stalked me and staged the entire encounter to frighten me, though I could not imagine what kind of person would go to such elaborate lengths for such a purpose. Then, 3 months after the incident, my neighbor disappeared. She was a woman named Jennifer Hartley, 32 years old, an accountant who lived 2 houses down from me and who I knew casually from neighborhood gatherings. She went out for her regular morning jog on the same trail where I had encountered the woman in yellow, and she never returned. Her car was found in the parking lot, her keys and phone locked inside, but there was no sign of Jennifer herself. The search for Jennifer lasted 2 weeks and involved dozens of volunteers, police tracking dogs, and helicopter flyovers with thermal imaging equipment. They found her yellow jogging jacket hung carefully on a tree branch deep in the forest in almost the exact location where I had found the jacket 3 months earlier. The pockets were turned inside out, and inside one pocket was a photograph of Jennifer jogging, taken from behind. The police connected her disappearance to my incident and reopened my case, interviewing me multiple times and asking me to walk them through exactly what had happened. I told them everything I could remember, but I had no new information to offer. Jennifer was never found. The investigation went cold after several months, and her case was added to the growing list of unexplained disappearances in the region. I think about Jennifer often, about the jacket and the photograph and the footsteps that followed me through the forest. I think about how easily it could have been me who disappeared, how I was saved only by luck or chance or some quality that made me an unsuitable victim for whatever was hunting on that trail. I have researched similar cases looking for patterns or explanations, and I have found more than I wanted to know. There are dozens of documented disappearances of solo joggers and hikers in the Pacific Northwest, many of them women, many of them on familiar trails near their homes. In several cases, witnesses reported seeing the missing person following or chasing someone else shortly before they vanished. In a few cases, personal items belonging to the missing person were found carefully displayed in the forest, as if left as markers or warnings. I do not jog anymore. The fear has taken that from me, has transformed something that was once a source of joy and health into a trigger for panic and hypervigilance. I have gained weight and lost fitness, and my doctor has expressed concern about my blood pressure and my stress levels. But I cannot bring myself to return to those trails, to risk encountering whatever it was that wore Jennifer's yellow jacket and led her into the forest. Sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my house, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat exactly, and I lie awake wondering if it has decided to come for me after all, if the thing that took Jennifer has grown tired of waiting for me to return to the forest. And sometimes, when I look out my window in the early morning, I see a figure in a yellow jacket standing at the edge of the woods, motionless and patient, and I know that it is still there, still hunting, still wearing the face of routine and safety to lure its next victim into the trees. There's a difference between believing in something and being consumed by belief. My sister learned that difference, and it nearly killed her. I was 33 years old in the spring of 2019 when I realized that Hannah, my younger sister by 5 years, had become involved with something that I could not understand and could not reach. We had grown up together in Olympia, Washington, the children of pragmatic parents who valued education and rational thought, and Hannah had always been the more sensitive of the two of us, the one who cried during movies and who talked about feeling energy in certain places or sensing the emotions of others. I had dismissed this as typical artistic temperament, a harmless quirk in someone who painted and wrote poetry, but I failed to recognize when that sensitivity crossed over into something darker and more dangerous. Hannah had struggled after college, unable to find work in her field and cycling through a series of unfulfilling jobs that left her depressed and directionless. When she discovered what she called a spiritual wellness group that held retreats in the Cascade Mountains, she told me it was exactly what she needed, a chance to reconnect with herself and with nature and with something larger than the grinding routine of daily life. I was happy for her, encouraged even because she seemed more animated and hopeful than she had been in years. The group called itself the Awakened Path, and from what Hannah told me in our increasingly infrequent phone conversations, it seemed to be a fairly standard New Age organization focused on meditation, plant-based diets, and communal living during weekend retreats. She showed me brochures with pictures of smiling people sitting in circles under towering pines, and she described workshops on mindfulness and breathwork and connecting with the natural world. The language was vague and grandiose in the way that such organizations always are, full of references to consciousness expansion and authentic living, but nothing about it raised immediate red flags for me. I had friends who had done similar retreats, attended yoga workshops and meditation intensives, and they had all returned refreshed and maybe a little pretentious, but fundamentally unchanged. I assumed Hannah would follow the same pattern, that she would spend a few weekends in the mountains and then return to normal life with perhaps a new interest in herbal tea and some inspirational quotes on her social media. But Hannah did not return to normal life. After her second retreat in April, she announced that she was taking an extended leave from her job to participate in what the group called a deep immersion experience, a month-long retreat where participants would live completely off-grid and focus entirely on their spiritual development. She seemed genuinely excited about this opportunity, and when I expressed concern about her taking so much time away from work and about the cost of the program, which I knew she could barely afford, she became defensive and told me that I did not understand because I had closed myself off to spiritual truth. This was not language I had ever heard her use before, and it troubled me. But I did not know how to articulate my concerns without sounding dismissive of something that clearly meant a great deal to her. I told her to be careful and to stay in touch, and she promised that she would call or text every few days so I would know she was safe. For the first week, she kept that promise. I received cheerful text messages describing the beauty of the mountain location, the warmth of the community, the profound insights she was gaining through meditation and group work. But after that first week, the messages stopped. I tried calling and texting with increasing frequency and urgency, but there was no response. I contacted the Awakened Path through the phone number listed on their website, and I was connected to a woman with a soft, patronizing voice who told me that Hannah was fine, that she had simply chosen to extend her retreat and to disconnect more fully from technology and external distractions. The woman explained that this was a common and healthy part of the process, that participants often realized they needed more time away from the noise of modern life, and that Hannah would be in touch when she felt ready. I did not find this reassuring. I demanded to speak with Hannah directly, and the woman told me that would not be possible, that Hannah was in deep meditation and could not be disturbed, but that she would pass along my concerns. Another week went by with no word from Hannah, and I contacted the rest of our family. Our parents were also concerned but less convinced that there was reason for alarm. They pointed out that Hannah was an adult, that she had chosen to participate in this retreat of her own free will, and that interfering might damage our relationship with her. They suggested that I give her more time, that I trust her judgment, but I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the sister I knew would not simply cut off all contact without explanation, and that the people at the Awakened Path were hiding something. I did research on the organization and found very little concrete information. They had a minimal web presence, just a simple website with vague descriptions of their philosophy and no real details about who ran the organization or where exactly their retreat center was located. There were no reviews, no testimonials, no articles or news stories about them. It was as if they had been designed to be invisible. I made the decision to drive to the retreat location myself. The woman on the phone had mentioned that the center was near Mount Baker, and after some detective work involving property records and satellite imagery, I located what I believed was the compound, a cluster of rustic cabins on private land accessed by a long dirt road. I drove up on a Saturday morning in late May, telling myself that I just wanted to see Hannah face to face to confirm that she was safe and happy, and then I would leave her alone. The road was rough and poorly maintained, winding through dense forest, and when I finally reached the property, I found it surrounded by a tall chain-link fence with a locked gate. There was a call box at the gate, and when I pressed the button, I was again connected to a woman with that same soft voice. I explained that I was Hannah Foster's brother and that I needed to see her, and the woman told me that Hannah was not receiving visitors at this time, that she was in a critical phase of her spiritual development, and that my presence would be disruptive to her progress. I tried to reason with the woman to explain that Hannah's family was worried about her, that we just wanted to know she was all right, but the woman was unmoved. She repeated that Hannah was fine, that she was exactly where she needed to be, and that I should respect her choices and leave the property. I refused to leave. I told the woman that I would call the police if she did not allow me to speak with Hannah. And there was a long pause before she responded. Finally, she said that if I came back that evening during the communal dinner at 7 p.m., they would make an exception and allow me to see Hannah briefly. I agreed, though I did not trust the arrangement, and I spent the day waiting at a coffee shop in the nearest town, growing increasingly anxious and certain that I was making a terrible mistake by waiting rather than simply calling the police immediately. I returned to the compound at 7 p.m. as instructed, and this time the gate was open. I drove through and parked near the largest cabin where I could see people moving around inside through the windows. 2 men in simple linen clothing emerged from the cabin and approached my car, their smiles friendly but their eyes cold and watchful. They introduced themselves as members of the community and offered to take me to Hannah, but they insisted that I leave my phone and my car keys with them, explaining that electronic devices disrupted the energy of the space and that they wanted to ensure I did not leave with Hannah if she was not ready to go. Every instinct told me this was wrong, but I was desperate to see my sister, so I handed over my phone and keys and followed the men into the compound. They led me to a smaller cabin set apart from the others, and when they opened the door, I saw Hannah sitting on the floor in the center of an empty room. The shock of her appearance hit me like a physical blow. She had always been slender, but now she looked skeletal, her cheekbones sharp and her eyes sunken in dark circles. Her hair, which she had always kept long and carefully styled, had been cut short and unevenly, as if she had done it herself with dull scissors. She was wearing the same linen clothing as the others, and she was rocking slowly back and forth, her gaze fixed on something I could not see. I called her name and rushed toward her, but she did not seem to recognize me at first. When I knelt in front of her and took her hands, which were cold and trembling, she looked at me with confusion and then with sudden fear. She began to speak, the words tumbling out in a rush, and what she said made no sense. She told me that the mountain was speaking through her, that she was a vessel for an ancient intelligence, that she had been chosen to receive transmissions that would save humanity from the corruption of modern life. She said that she could hear the voice constantly now, whispering in a language that only she could understand, and that she was so close to full ascension, so close to becoming something more than human. She begged me not to interrupt the process, told me that I did not understand what was happening to her, and when I tried to pull her to her feet, she fought me with surprising strength, screaming that I was ruining everything, that I was breaking the transmission. The two men who had escorted me rushed into the cabin, along with several others, and they tried to separate me from Hannah. What followed was chaotic and violent. I refused to let go of my sister, refused to leave her in that place, and I fought them with everything I had. Someone punched me in the face, and I felt my nose break and blood pour down my chin. But I managed to get Hannah to her feet and to drag her toward the door. She was still screaming, still fighting me, but I was bigger and stronger, and I had the advantage of desperation. We made it outside, and I could see my car in the distance, could see the open gate beyond it, and I ran toward it with Hannah struggling in my arms. We escaped. I do not remember the details of how we got to my car or how I managed to start it without my keys, which I must have grabbed from one of the men at some point, or how I drove down that winding road with Hannah thrashing in the passenger seat and trying to open the door to jump out. What I remember is arriving at the hospital in Bellingham and carrying my unconscious sister through the emergency room doors, her body limp and her breathing shallow. The doctors told me later that she was severely malnourished and dehydrated, that she had multiple vitamin deficiencies and her electrolyte levels were dangerously imbalanced, and that if I had waited even another week to find her, she might have died or suffered permanent organ damage. I contacted the police from the hospital and I gave them a full statement about what I had seen at the compound. They raided the property the following day and found 14 people in various states of physical and psychological distress, all of them showing signs of malnutrition and manipulation. The investigation revealed that the Awakened Path was essentially a cult that used isolation and food deprivation and constant indoctrination to break down participants' sense of self and make them dependent on the group. The leader, a man who called himself Brother Everett, had convinced his followers that he was channeling messages from a mountain spirit and that through him they could achieve transcendence. Charges were filed against several members of the organization for fraud, false imprisonment, and assault. But Brother Everett himself disappeared before the raid and has never been found. Hannah spent 3 months in psychiatric treatment, and the road to recovery has been long and difficult. She has no memory of much of her time at the compound, which the doctors say is probably a mercy, a protective mechanism her mind employed to cope with trauma. But there are still periods when she seems to slip away, when she stares at the mountains visible from her apartment window and whispers things in a language none of us recognize. She has been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative episodes, and she takes medication to help manage the symptoms, but she is not the person she was before she met the Awakened Path. The sister I knew, the one who painted and wrote poetry and felt things deeply, has been replaced by someone who is fragile and distant and haunted. 2 years after I brought Hannah home, I received a package in the mail at my address in Olympia. There was no return address and the postmark was smudged and unreadable. Inside was a photograph of Hannah taken at the compound, smiling and serene, surrounded by other members of the group. On the back of the photograph was written a message in careful handwriting. She was so close to ascension. We will finish what was started. The photograph was recent, taken after I had supposedly rescued her, though Hannah has no memory of it being taken. I reported the package to the police and they increased patrols around Hannah's apartment and added her to a watch list, but they have been unable to trace the origin of the package or identify who sent it. Hannah and I moved to the East Coast 6 months ago, putting as much distance as possible between ourselves and Washington State. We both changed our names legally, and we do not maintain contact with most of our old friends or acquaintances. But still, some nights I wake to find Hannah standing at her window, staring west toward where the mountains would be if we could see them from here. And I hear her whispering in that strange language. And I know that whatever Brother Everett and the Awakened Path did to her, whatever they planted in her mind during those weeks of isolation and starvation, it has not been fully removed. She is still connected to them somehow, still hearing their voice, and I live in constant fear that one day I will wake up to find her gone, that she will have walked out in the middle of the night to answer a call that I cannot hear, to return to the mountains and the people who believe she belongs to them.